All right. Cool. Well, what we kind of thought we would do is we've gone pretty in depth in this, just not to kind of confuse anything, but just give like an in-depth, I guess, overview of what we will think about in a rehab. And so we want to present like our model and how we think about certain things, and then we're going to try and talk about through like the challenges that we had with like this individual athlete with previous injury history and medical history and all these sort of things, and then how we changed their rehab around that and competition and stuff. So it's a bit full on, and if you have any questions, just put your hand up and ask. Like, we want to make it like interactive and just literally just say like, hey, what does that even mean, or like whatever it is. Because a lot of it is, because Ash is also a track coach and she's a sprinter. Like a lot of this stuff, like if I was doing it solo, I wouldn't even know because it's really specific to like track sprinting. So yeah. But yeah, I guess first of all we'll introduce ourselves. So I'm Hugh, and I'm an exercise physiologist. So my background has been in probably more strength conditioning than anything. So I work in North Melbourne Football Club and run their rehab program there, and then work at Southside with Ash now, predominantly with like footy players, runners, and then just a lot of like gen pop more than anything. So yeah, like knee replacements, sore back, sore hips, probably the similar stuff that you would see here as well.
And then you've got like some neuro.
Yeah, I got some clients that have Parkinson's or have had a stroke and that type of stuff too. So my favourite thing about being EP is that you get to see so much of that. Like I find if I'm only doing like strength conditioning, for example, get a bit like, it gets a bit repetitive. And you got like someone with Parkinson's or this or that, and it's like, it's cool to have to continuously like be on your feet and keep learning.
And I'm Ashley. I'm an osteo, been qualified for almost 9 years now. And then I'm also a track coach, so I've been coaching for probably around 5 years from the speed side of things. And I work with anywhere from like 8-year-olds all the way up to, I think my oldest client's 92. So you can see a whole range of different things, but very much musc-based. And then from the speed side of things, we've worked with juniors all the way up to elite athletes.
Cool.
Yeah.
We're good guys.
Ash, just on the track side,
Yeah.
is it just for coaches who are track coaches, do you need to do something specific, or is it just your experience over the years?
Yeah,
you can start coaching as a track coach.
Yeah, so my dad was a sprint coach as well.
Yeah.
So I grew up in that environment. So Dad actually had one of the Australia's fastest 100-metre sprinter when I was very, very young. So Jared Keating, I think he ran a 10:08 or something like that. So I grew up in that environment, and I've been running since I was like 5 years old. But to be able to coach, Athletics Australia have different accreditation, just like ASCA have like level 1, level 2, level 3. It's the same kind of thing from Athletics Australia. So you just start off with as a youth coach with level 1, you just work your way up, that sort of things. And then once you have that, you have insurance to be able to coach from a part of that association.
Nice.
Yeah.
Cool.
All right. So these are the 5 components of our rehab model, or the phases that we think about. What we wanted you guys to do is just have a quick discussion around, you are probably a bit already knowledgeable about this, mate. So have a little discussion around what those 5 stages are and where you think they kind of link into each other, and what kind of order you would expect that to be.
So what do you think happens first?
I think
I feel like return to task would probably be towards the end.
load introduction would be somewhere possibly the start, or task integration could be afterwards, possibly, I think.
Injury and protection potentially could play a role really throughout the whole continuum, because you're always trying to manage that injury and protect it, don't want your parents occurring.
Accumulation would be after load, I'd say. So once you've introduced some load, we want to accumulation phase.
Yep.
So definitely after load introduction.
Yep.
How would you guys do it from 1 to 5?
Yeah, like load introduction first. You go accumulation from there. Probably looking at task integration, because again, it's maybe more specifics you're looking at, then returning to the task and injury, connection, reduction, probably flows throughout the whole chain of it, but it's still probably a component that once you've reintegrated the task, that you're still trying to prevent injury occurring against it. Cool.
Yeah, I guess the point of it as well is like it is kind of fluid. So like if someone comes in, they're not always at the injury or protection stage, and like you said, like it can run for more than just one kind of little bit. Like you don't just tick the box and you're on to the next one. But that's, I guess, predominantly how we would look at it. Because say someone presents with a hamstring injury to Ash, for example, and it happened 2 days ago, probably trying to go through the injury and protection phase. So think like, what are we doing? We're trying to minimize pain or swelling, like things like that before we can move on to introducing load, accumulating that load, having a think about what returning to function means for them. So like in this case, for the sprinter, we're going to go through, like, we broke down the demands of the task, which is sprinting, but for someone that's just wants to get back to like taking their kids to school, or it could even be just getting up and down out of a chair after a hip replacement, like if that's the task, we kind of try and want to work backwards. So like how can we, I guess, accumulate volume of things that are relevant to the task and slowly return them, like integrate the task and then return them back to doing what they want. So I guess what we try and do is we visualize it from where they're at now and where they want to be, and then how we can work backwards.
All right. Does that all make sense?
Yeah.
So we thought to highlight and explain kind of how we think and what we think about in each of those, we'd go through a little bit of a case study. So we've got Fia, who's a 25-year-old female. She's a sprinter. She does 200 and 400 metre events. On the 1st of Jan, she noticed pain in her hamstring during a training session. She was doing 150 metre efforts and at 100% intensity, and she was meant to do 4 to 5 reps with a 8 to 10 minute recovery between each of those. And she noticed on the first rep she started to get some tightness and discomfort in her hamstring. She thought she'd be okay to continue to run on. She ran her second set and then developed a much sharper and more significant pain from there. The pain that she felt was lateral mid-hamstring, sharp in nature. It felt like she had strained it. She has a big history of hamstring strains, so she has that awareness of what that feels like. So she's had 3 previous left hamstring strains, anywhere from grade 1 to 3, and her most significant one was in 2023, where she had to get it surgically reattached. So she had a proximal where she ripped the tendon off the attachment. She's also got bilateral hamstring tendinopathy. She's been managing this for a few years now, but the left side actually resolved post-surgery, so she doesn't have any tendinopathy on that left side anymore, but she still notices that right tendinopathy every day. She also had a left tibial stress fracture in 2022. She actually kicked a barbell and created some stress reaction from that, and then she continued to run on that for a long period of time, and it developed into a stress fracture. And then she's also got some anterior lateral left hip pain, which has been on and off since the surgery. So she knows she gets really tight throughout her hips. Every time she gets really tight throughout her hips, she starts to develop that anterior lateral hip pain, and that's particularly when she notices that tendinopathy as well.
This is obviously going to be a lot to remember, but which is why I got the sheet. But also, just trying to highlight like the understanding of the individual. Like a lot of questioning obviously would have gone into finding out things like this, and just hoping to highlight like that we know this much because we've been asking these questions, and we're trying to find out as much possible information about the individual, because that is what will dictate our rehab.
What given that the quite extensive.
Yeah.
What are some of the questions that you're asking to better understand the nature, the severity, or are you just asking simply like, have you had any previous hamstring strains or hamstring tears on that same side? Like, are you just kind of asking those questions, or are you asking like other things about?
So I've got a template that I go through in my initial consultation. So not that I always stick to that template all the time, but I've just got reminders to kind of dig a little bit deeper about certain things. So we run on all 45-minute sessions, so we can spend a lot of time communicating and understanding our client as much as possible. So I like to be able to keep it as open as possible and kind of go down whichever path comes to light in that conversation, but then I've got reminders to dig deeper about certain things as well.
I feel like often, like if you say less in those consultations as well, like if they keep talking, they'll tell you things that they think is relevant, or things that they think that could lead to stuff like this. I think I'd find a lot of the questioning was probably around what she was doing at the time of the previous injury. Like you would have been working on or trying to work out what she was doing from like a track perspective, gym perspective, that type of thing, to work out like how much is actually tipping her over the edge. Then you have a bit of a starting point.
Do you guys have like a monitoring strategy to monitor, particularly for someone coming back post hamstring in general, those other external factors, particularly as well?
Yep, we'll go through it. Yeah. So we'll basically try to provide like a pretty big overview and hopefully just provoke some thought.
So her medical history, she was diagnosed with celiac disease in 2023, where she noticed a lot of bloating, mood changes, inability to concentrate. That's really well managed now. She's been seeing a dietitian to get that under control. She works as a PT, so her hours are pretty sporadic, but also quite flexible in the sense of she can train whenever we like and things like that. From a sleep perspective, she aims for 8 to 9 hours a night, but that can be hard because at times she might start at 5:30 in the morning. And from a stress perspective, she's naturally quite stressed and she overthinks things quite a lot. So something to keep in mind just from a nervous system perspective. And then digging a little bit deeper, from a competition perspective, she's only actually raced once in the last 3.5 years. So we look at her injury history over the last 3 to 4 years, it's quite significant, and it's actually stopped her from being able to compete for such a long period of time. So there's going to be some psychological components around returning to competition and things like that we need to address to make sure that she's in the best place she can be. And the only race that she's done in that time was a relay race 2 weeks before this last injury as well. So quite frequent. So it was such a big period of time that she hadn't competed. She competed once and then she got injured again. So she was pretty flat about that side of things. Ooh. So this is so we broke down, I got her to break down what did her week look like from a training perspective before coming on board and starting with us. So on Mondays, she was doing some sprint training, which involved some block starts and some speed endurance. So her typical session would be 5 to 6 200-metre efforts at 25 to 26 second pace on 8 minutes. So she get an 8-minute recovery between each of those reps. So to put that into perspective, she's a high 23 runner, so it's probably around like a 90% effort for her in those efforts. And then the following day on Tuesday, she'd be doing a lower body gym. Then on Wednesday, she was doing some curved treadmill, which is more of an endurance session for her. So she was doing 10 rounds of 15 seconds on, 60 seconds off, and she was holding 20 k's per hour for that 15-second effort. And then she was doing her upper body gym post that. Then she was doing Pilates on Thursdays, into track on Fridays, where she was doing 200s again, but she was just doing 2 to 3 reps at 30 seconds, so a bit slower than what she was doing on the Mondays. And she was doing 2 sets of that. So she was still probably accumulating a similar volume as what she was in the Monday session, but she was doing that at a lower intensity. And then they were finishing with 1 to 2 max efforts for a 300-metre effort. And then she'd go to the gym and she was doing a French contrast session the gym on Fridays, and then she was running Saturdays. She was meant to be doing sand dunes, but her hamstring wouldn't allow her to tolerate a lot of sand dunes, so they were alternating between sand dunes and pool running to help try and manage the tendinopathy side of things. And then her only rest day was on Sundays. What does everyone think about that type of training load?
Yeah. Is this being programmed by
So this was her being programmed by her previous
previous
coach.
coach?
Yeah.
A lot of high intensity stuff.
There's a lot of load going through that tendon in a week with not a lot of recovery.
Yeah. That's the biggest thing for me. I don't think she has adequate recovery components through any of her. If we look at her first 3 days, lowers. Pilates, probably a component of lowers. Coming into track, lowers. Coming into Saturday, lowers. And then Sunday being her only rest day where she's not using any of that. So,
Gym sessions.
Pardon?
How hard was the gym sessions?
she worked pretty hard, yeah. So that's probably the biggest thing that jumped out to me. And then also the next thing that jumped out to me was the quality of her sessions that she's doing. I don't think she's getting the speed stimuluses that she needs. All of the sessions are pretty similar in their programming, so I don't think she's never hitting max speed in her sessions. So I think that's something that's lacking. I'll go through and explain some of the other stuff later.
I quickly ask, what's the French contrast session?
French contrast is
Like a heavy strength powered with. So like, let's say you're going to do like.
you pick 4 exercises that are similar in output. Would you say? Like
Nah,
similar
so
movement?
if you've had like a heavy trap bar deadlift, let's say, as like A1, like it's your first exercise, you would pair it with like a counter movement jump, for example, unloaded. Yeah.
They were doing 4
Yeah.
exercises in one block.
Well, okay.
But they were just doing one block.
Yeah.
You
Yeah.
To get out.
Yeah. So it's probably like I think it's probably not a bad thing for someone like a sprinter, but it's probably more the timing of when it was done, I guess.
You don't need to do that when you're
Yeah.
significantly fatigued.
Exactly. Yeah. It's pretty like advanced, I'd
And
say.
then also, you're not really like, what are you priming for?
Yeah.
Like you're going into a pull or a June session, which
Yeah.
from a nervous system perspective, you don't need a lot of output. So if you did that, maybe leading into a bit more of an Excel or a max speed day, maybe that'd be more suitable.
Did this athlete talk about how she progressively overloaded this program,
No.
or was it pretty much this every week?
The-
Yeah, she changes a bit.
We
but
discussed a little bit of that, but she was like, "This is what a standard week would
would
look
look
like."
like.
Yeah.
Okay, gotcha.
I reckon because she's a PT as well, it probably made it a bit tricky because she probably like had her ideas around what she should be doing, and like even
We've changed things heaps for her.
Yeah.
It's taken time to adapt and understand why we've changed.
Discussing those like different movement strategies from someone who's in the field, like how was that? Like, did you get a lot of kind of like resistance from the idea of
No, less than
changing some things, or
no, less than others in the sense of when she came on board, she fully bought into that.
Yeah.
We did have to have a lot of discussions around, like, she'd always ask to do more, and I'd always
Just
push
say
back
no,
and say,
yeah.
no, this is what we've planned and this is what we're going to do. But she would always listen to that, accept that, and
Yeah.
take that on board. So she was always really respectful around why we were doing something and understood why that was. But she also still had the drive to want to do more, just because that's how she's trained in the past.
It's an interesting conversation I have with people who have certain ways of wanting to do things, and
We're
you're
lucky.
trying to
Do you know Mark, that one of the other guys in Australia? Big guy.
golfer guy.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So like he went from doing like 6 strength sessions a week, and like we had to peel things back heaps for him to be able to sprint, and he just loves training so much. Like I have a lot more resistance there than with Rehab.
Because it can be like a tricky conversation to navigate, particularly if you've got someone who's pretty hell-bent on their ways of doing things, and then you're trying to expose them into a different way of doing things. It can be creative. Yeah.
I think it made it slightly easier the fact that she hadn't been able to compete in so long. Like I think she knew that there's something going on that's probably not right. Cool. So if we go into like the phases that we were talking about before of the model, what do you guys think would be important? So say like she presented to us or someone presented to you, maybe it's like we'll put ourselves in like a physio shoe, but someone's come in, like what do you think that we would be doing as a first step from an injury and protection sort of phase?
Like education, honestly start off
Yep.
just like looking at it exactly like what you guys did with the training volume and be like, okay, like we've got to strip someone's back and tinker with it. Because again, she's already getting injured consistently. There's obviously some issue with her training volume and training amount of what she's doing.
Yep.
So that is probably going to be an opponent, key component to get her on board with also what you guys are trying to get out of her. Otherwise, you're just going to get resistances. She's not too sure as to what she's going to get out of it really.
Yeah, I think the key, the keyword education, it probably goes through really every single phase, like from getting injured all the way to getting back to their sport or task. Education's obviously, continuous. But these are kind of some of the things that we will start to think about when someone comes to us and we're trying to kind of plan out their rehab and what it's going to look like. Probably having some of these kind of thoughts in our head at this stage. So, like why was the injury occurring? It's like why she had 3 hamstring injuries in a row. Like the first thing to think about is like what's her track volume like? What's she doing in the gym from a strength perspective? Like how is the tendinopathy affecting her? These type of things. And then obviously we start to think about like how long the phase is actually going to last till we can move her to the next one. And it's different case by case.
Case by case, depending on what injury it is, but also like we have to keep that fluid as well, depending on how she's progressing through things and tolerating the loads that we're trying to put her through as well. All right.
So this is probably a bit more in depth than what I just touched on, but this is kind of our thoughts at this stage. So it's the injury and protection phase. She's come to see Ash. Basically, the first thing is like understanding her. So that was just asking all those questions around training loads and the things that we touched on earlier. From there as well, like obviously it's important to work out, and this is in no order by the way, it's important to work out where she actually wants to get back to. So in Fia's case, it was like running nationals and being able to tolerate 400 metres without getting injured. The diagnosis and prognosis, like she'd already come to us with the diagnosis, but Ash kind of gave her the prognosis of like we can work backwards from nationals, and so we'll work towards that. Education, as you touched on, probably the most important thing really. I think one of the key things I find with anyone, like especially athletes, but with anyone, is like no one wants to be injured, so we've got to try and work out like day one what they actually can do and try and get them doing that. So if someone comes to me and say they've got a sore back and I don't know, they're prepping for a back surgery or something, like, and they've been relatively active, instead of having them just do fuck all until the surgery starts, it's like, all right, can I get them on like an arm erg? Can I get them on a row and they have their feet on the floor and they're just using their arms? Can we get them on a spin bike? Like, just for like even a mental perspective. Obviously, looking at their movement capacity. So one of the things that Ash did early on, obviously recovery as well is really important, especially in the days following like an injury. There's going to be inflammation and healing occurring. Like how can we kind of speed up the recovery? So like at footy, for example, what we would do is if a player gets injured, straight away I would link them with sports psych, we'd link them with the doc, we'd link them with the dietitian, link them in with the S&Cs, and we would create like a really big plan straight away. Basically the day after it happens, it's like, this is what you need to do from a recovery perspective to get you back as soon as possible. The psychological elements we touched on earlier as well. So with her, obviously she was pretty down in the dumps, being injured so much and then getting injured again. And then just onboarding her as well, like how we use our systems. I want everyone to leave the first session with me, and Ash is the same, like actually knowing what they do next. So I think it's really important, like if I say, there's always a lot of talking, so it's confusing, but the one thing that I always drill in is like, I'm going to invite you to this app, I'm going to put it all in there for you, I want you to do this for me, do that for me, and just make it really clear so they can walk away straight away going, all right, Hugh said this, and I've got to do this for him before I see him next time. I think I hear it a lot where someone will come from another physio or something and they'll go, oh, like he told me to do something, but I can't really remember what it was, or like he said something, but I forgot. It's like, so I really want to avoid that. The number one thing is like that there's clarity in what they're doing.
And we reinforce that multiple times. So we do that in
Yeah.
a session, then we send a follow-up email after our first session to really clearly understand this is what we discussed and this is what we're working on right now.
You're still sending your big emails.
Mate.
OG.
Yeah.
I love it.
That's all right.
How long after her recent hamstring occurrence did she come to you?
So I had my first conversation with her 2 weeks post.
Okay.
Yeah,
And had she done anything?
Yeah, so she'd seen a physio
Okay.
there. So she saw a physio for the first 3 weeks and then she transitioned to me from there.
And how did she get in contact with you?
So she was already training in the 6th
Okay.
from a gym perspective.
Yeah.
And I'd known Vita for probably 3 or 4 years
Okay,
before
yeah.
that, just from a track perspective.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Cool.
So the specifics around this component was the injury occurred on the 1st of Jan. An MRI confirmed that she had a left 2B hamstring strain. So you can see on the image there, this is her MRI. That green line is the length of her tear. The prognosis, we based that off competing at nationals 14 weeks post-injury. Obviously, she has a complex history of injury and competition. At the first discussion that I had with her 2 weeks post-injury, she had already decided to leave her coach from that side of things because of the injuries that she has sustained. Her goals were to compete at nationals on April the 11th, but for her to do so, she had to run a national qualifier by March the 25th. So she had to be at least back to competition by that point. We started to do some weekly structure planning for her, and we decided that the protection phase would be 0 to 14 days. So she had already gone through that protection phase by the time we started together. And that's so the physio looked after that component for her.
Cool. So we use this is it's relatively new, but it's a muscle grading like classification system. It's called BAMIC, and basically it's based off track athletes. You use this at footy though as well, just to grade the type of injury. So you can still have like a 1, 2, 3 rating, but then there's now like an A, B, C. So A is like a more kind of, I guess, superficial, like myofascial injury. 2B, which is what she had, is at the tendon's junction. So if you think like where the muscle meets the tendon, that's where the damage has occurred, like they've pulled apart. And then intratendinous, which is like the kind of bigger ones, is when the tendon itself up here will basically split. So that's what will require surgery, and often the tendon will actually like retract. So it's a bit of a kind of trickier one. So we use the BAMIC framework in terms of guiding the rehab process a little bit, but we have changed a lot of the exercise prescription and then running prescription as well, because it's based off like Olympic level athletes that are crazy fast. But I think it's just important to note that like we wanted to follow I guess some of the different phases. So like their rehab model is like acute, remodeling and functional. And we kind of spread that out to, I guess, our phases. So that's what's involved. But it's important to note that because she came in after, I guess, what you would call the acute phase in their rehab, she didn't come to us till essentially week 3, really. And the physio didn't have her doing much. It kind of pushed back the start of it. So we kind of like back-ended the rehab a little bit.
And we also decided to take it a little bit easier because of her history of injury in the past as well. It's the same side as she had the surgery on in the past as well, so we thought we'd just extend that just a little bit compared to what a rehab model might look like for them.
Yep. Yeah, so I guess that's the loading progressions that they recommend. It's not something that we really went along with, but just we put it in here to highlight like that they are thinking about things like that too.
And this is just some research around some of the biomechanical components that are linked to hamstring strains. So when she does return to running, these are the things that I want to keep in mind and determine, does she have any of these components in her running that are probably going to increase her risk of a hamstring injury. I'll let you know now. She had one of those when we first returned to running, which was a trunk lateral flexion. But that was, so when she first returned to running, she still had her tendinopathy. When we got her tendinopathy resolved, her trunk flexion resolved as well. So she doesn't have a huge amount of the biomechanical components. So it means that most likely it's a loading issue as opposed to a biomechanical issue.
How early on did you assess her running from like a technical point of view to establish any?
From a technical perspective, probably around 4 weeks in. So we got her jogging straight away, which we didn't really assess. Like it's just around tolerating getting running again. It's probably around week 5. I've got all of her running progressions in here.
So like you're seeing her week 5 or like week 5 of her original? So
week 5 of her injury.
But you also asked for footage of her previous races to have a look as well, before she was even running. Yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah, no.
No, you go.
With the biomechanical side, are you looking for a certain type of mechanics? Because I know everyone biomechanically may
Yeah, I wouldn't say there's like one perfect
size
biomechanical.
fits all. Yeah, for sure.
I've definitely got biases towards certain biomechanics that I think
Certain
are
postures.
more appropriate and give you better performance / decreased risk of injury.
Yep.
So like I think there's certain things to work on,
Okay.
but I'm also not of the belief that everyone has to look the same when they sprint.
So you're not trying to teach someone from scratch how to run again necessarily.
No,
It's
not
just
necessarily.
tinkering a few
Yeah.
bits and pieces.
Yeah.
Just a side question as well. One of the challenges I think I possibly see. How did you guys go with getting buy-in from her to trust you guys? Being that she had a track coach who maybe didn't do a fantastic job possibly, and now you guys were going to look after her rehab.
Yeah.
Did you focus a lot on the rapport building, relationship building stuff?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And because we already had a relationship with her, I think it became a little bit easier.
She
And
trusted you guys.
and because like from a very early days, like we broke down like this is what it looks like and this is what the whole plan looks like, and she had access from that at the start. She felt really comfortable throughout that process. Whereas I think if we just played it by ear a little bit and just gave drips and drab things, I think she would have felt a little bit more uneasy. And she was already in the gym, which is where we're based now as well. So like it was just easy for her to feel comfortable in that sense.
Nice. Cool.
So I guess these are some of the rehab principles we sort of went with. So yeah, trying to get it to mobilise it early, get it moving as early as possible, and I guess the safe and optimal loading bit, like it's just so different from person to person. So it's like a little bit of, I guess, trial and error, but try and keep it under 3 out of 10 from like a pain perspective. Some of the things that we're thinking about is like proximally and distally loading the hamstring. So not just going gung-ho at one more so than the other, even though it was a little bit tricky because she had the tendinopathy. So anything distally was a bit trickier early days. There was a lot of research in that BAMIC paper that you want to introduce, like they called it return to competition, but it was essentially like higher outputs over 80% after the 35-day mark. So what we found is before the 27-day mark, the re-injury rate was just over 60%. But if you wait until after the 35-day mark, it was like 2.9%. So we kind of had this idea in our head that we don't want to introduce like high-speed running, so over 80% of her max velocity, until after the 35-day mark, just because we knew that she had that compromised or the injury history. So yeah, we kind of, that was like a big thing that we had in mind. And then, yeah, just with the structure of it, like we'll show you the structure that how we changed our week, but the big thing was to be doing hamstring strength stuff and just training in general really after track, prioritize the track first and build and top up hamstring strength around that.
these are the factors from my discussions with her around why I think her injury occurred. I think her weekly structure was poorly planned, as we went through before. She obviously has a previous injury history of hamstrings. The number one factor of hamstring injury is previous history, so we know that they can reoccur. Her training stimulus, she had far too much speed endurance exposure, and it was really, and then not enough max speed exposure. So from conversations with her, that 150 that she did was 100% effort, but it was the first 100% effort she'd done for months. So 150 metres is far too long to do 100% effort. Like, we do 60-metre efforts at 100% as opposed to 150. So I think that the choice of max speed was wrong in that sense as well. Recovery aspects, she probably doesn't quite sleep enough for her high training load, and only having one rest day per week with her high training load as well, I don't think is adequate. She also had a lack of eccentric strength work in her program because she had the tendinopathy. She couldn't do any RDL, she couldn't do any trap bar, she couldn't do anything. It just irritated her hamstring tendon. And then from a loading pattern perspective, because she's a 200-metre runner and a 400-metre runner, they run the bend and they load the left side more significantly than the right side. So I think that will just contribute to a fatigue factor. The left leg will fatigue a little bit more and might just increase her risk of losing form because she's a bit more fatigued on that side.
Cool. So I'm interested to gauge, like, if we're going to introduce like strength training, like what you guys would do. So she's now, say, 5 weeks post hamstring injury. What's that?
This would be 3 weeks.
3 weeks post. Where are we looking to start from like a strength perspective, or like how you go about it? So basically the physio had her doing straight leg isometric. So like she's kind of like had her feet up on a box and was just doing iso holds for 20 seconds straight leg at that stage.
Probably start to introduce some range of motion then.
Yeah.
Yeah, or some concentric. She couldn't do any eccentric really at all?
She actually could, she just hadn't been.
Okay.
Yeah. So yeah, it's essentially we were trying to work out what she was capable of, keeping in mind the rehab principle of like probably 3 out of 10 or less pain. Sort of having a play around, see how she'd feel. And then if you go next slide, we'll go through what we think is important at this stage.
That's me, mate. Still run around a little bit. Hey. You go through it, mate.
All right. Well, I guess, yeah, at this stage, we think it's important to get, data to understand baseline and develop a plan. And we were lucky that because she was already training at the gym that we work out of, we actually had a lot of her testing just from a performance perspective. So like counter movement jumps, things like that. So we kind of knew where we needed to get her back to. And then through investigation and asking her PB times and stuff, we could work out like what max speed she could probably hit and how long she had to sustain it and things like that. So we had a really good understanding of what she needed to get back to. We broke down the requirements of the actual task that she's getting back to. So like being able to tolerate this weekend, for example, running 3 400s and potentially three 200s, all in the space of a few days. Because I think when we're thinking about the requirements of a task too, I always think worst case. So like with a footy player, for example, I'll look at all their GPS data over the last year if they've got injured, and I'll pick the biggest sessions that they've done throughout a week, and then the bigger games that they've had in terms of like total volume, high speed running, like change of direction count. And what I will do is build them up to that, because you never know, like if you put them back on the field to their average game and then they have their biggest game for some reason, like there's a positional change or something, they might not actually be able to tolerate that. So kind of always think from like, what is a worst case in the sense of like, what are they going to actually have to do? So yeah, just thinking about like some of the factors that we need to overcome or to develop. And then pretty lucky with the way that it all worked out, because Ash was at the track with Fia. They go to the track session, then she'd come train and do a rehab at the gym afterwards, have access to all the recovery equipment and stuff like that. But just familiarising her with the process of that, minimising questions, and I think the less questions someone has about that sort of thing, there's more clarity, which is good. And then, yeah, well, you hit the nail on the head before, it's just always keeping up the education component. Even to this day, like she's running tomorrow, but you're probably still educating her right now about how she should approach things and stuff like that.
Did you know the breakdown of her event schedule before?
Well, so
Like,
she
or during
she hadn't qualified for anything at that stage. So we were hopeful that she could do a 4 and a 2.
Yeah.
Well, actually, no, we were hopeful that she was just going to do the 4, and then she was running really well. So we're like, all right, she probably will qualify for a 2 as well if we wanted to. We allowed her to do a 2, and she qualified. So then that just increased the volume a little bit. If she makes, I've got a decision to make, but if she makes the final of the 4, I could decide if I'd let her do the 2. Though, not quite sure if she's going to tolerate that much. So we'll see. We'll see how I go with that.
We'll let you know next week.
Yeah.
Decisions.
Well, I think the worst case scenario is if we come out of nationals and she gets injured. It'd suck. It'd suck a lot. So I'd rather her not run and be safe. As much as she'd probably be disappointed in that.
That's right.
So from a case specifics perspective, as Hugh said before, we had Nordboard and ACCEPT data previously. So that was really helpful to understand where she was pre-injury, where we had to get her back to, and hopefully improve upon so she has a greater capacity so she doesn't continue to get injured.
So do you guys know what ACCEPT stuff is? ACCEPT? Do you know what it is?
Yeah, it's like
Yeah,
a force,
it's like
force
force
plates.
Yeah.
Force plates, and then they've got like a dyno and like a pullet component as well.
It's like valves, but just the
Exactly,
accent rate.
exactly the same. Yeah. So at my first conversation with her at 2 weeks, she hadn't introduced any running. I said realistically she should be able to, regardless, she should be able to jog by 14 days. So she went back and asked her physio. Physio allowed her to start to jog. So we introduced running straight away from that point. Super slow, just accumulating some running. So we started at 4 meters per second. We introduced bike and pool sessions from 3 weeks onwards, and that was to try and maintain her lactic energy system. With a 400 metre, there's a couple of energy systems, but the lactic kicks in. So we wanted to keep that as best we can, but minimise the stress that kind of went through the hamstring while we did that. So we chose the pool and the bike for that. And Fia joined our track group from 3 weeks onwards, which allowed us to have full control of the rehab and her programming. It means that we were able to play around with the weeks however we liked, we were able to progress however we liked. It meant that I was with her 4 times a week as well, so I could just have lots of touch base with her, continue to educate her and make her feel really comfortable throughout that process. And one thing she mentioned from her old coaches, often her coach would just send her the sessions to do. So she mentioned like me being there gave her a lot more confidence to be able to get through the sessions than just being left alone to do those sessions. So then, this is like certainly not an in-depth breakdown of what the task is, but I just want to give you an idea of some of the things that I'm starting to think about from a task perspective. So from a sprinting side of things, we're talking about rapid ground contact, so anywhere from 0.2 to 0.8 seconds. So she has to be on and off the ground really quickly. We've got a high ground reaction force, so anywhere from 1,000 to 4,000 newtons depending on speed. We have with an increase in velocity, we have an increase in hamstring load. So if we take 5 meters per second, we've got 2.66 times body weight. When we're at 9 meters per second, we've got 8.95 times body weight. So a really significant increase as the velocity increases. So we have to be mindful of how quickly we are progressing the velocity. We've got some technical components, so acceleration and max speed should look a little bit different, so there's certain things that we're looking for in those. And then what kind of energy systems does she need to be developed to have a good performance So then we had, so these are her running speeds. So these were based off her times that she had completed. So her 100 metre, she was able to run 11.6, her 200, 23.5, and her 400, 54.30. So we were planning around being back at this same capacity, ideally at Nationals at that point, which means that we can break down from that time and the distance, we can break down how many metres per second she needs to be able to cover. So we need to be able to have her at least tolerating 8.61 over 100 metres. But then from that we can estimate what her top speed would be. So I estimated her top speed being around 36 k's an hour, 37 k's an hour, which equates to kind of 10.5-ish metres per second, slightly under. So from a top speed perspective, we need her to be able to tolerate that aspect as well.
Which is bloody quick.
You keeping up?
That's the worst case. That's the
Worst slash
case
best,
event.
right?
Yep.
Like, you need to get it to that point.
Yep.
She needs to be at that
Going
point.
to be the mat one.
Yep.
Yeah, absolutely.
The
Well-
highest that, you never know, but
Hopefully this weekend.
I'm confident she'll run a PB this weekend. Yeah. So.
I'll be straight to sports bet, mate. Don't worry.
So then, some of the objective measures that we are trying to get are, we use the force plates to just do an isometric hamstring bridge, and then we use the Nord board to get some eccentric data, and then we use the force plates also from a drop jump and a drop hop perspective. That just gives us some detail around kind of her nervous system output, but how long she's spending on the ground, how high she can jump, what her RSI is, and those types of things. So we can use that as a really important monitoring tool to see how fatigued she is from the training loads that we're putting her under. So we do this relatively frequently to understand what's her output like, and if she's really starting to drop from that output, we just tweak training load to then recover well to then be able to continue to push on.
How often are you assessing this?
So the upper part, probably anywhere from every 2 to 3 weeks.
Yep.
The lower part, ideally weekly.
Okay.
So be careful when you do things like the Nord board because it's super maximal. It's like very taxing to your nervous system. Like you would probably.
We did the Nord board a lot less
Yeah.
because she was sprinting before coming in and doing her gym stuff. So like we always think sprinting is already going to get quite a lot of that eccentric load anyway, and she's going to be quite fatigued through there. I was mindful of how frequently we were doing that. So just to give you some understanding, this is what the accent details are like. So on the whole left-hand side is the isometric component for the hamstring. Just to give you an example, so that is with a box. The force plate is on the box. They just rest their heel on, and then they just pull their heel down as hard as they can, hold for 3 seconds, and relax. And they just repeat that 3 times. So if you look at the top component, the spike up is when they're pulling in, how they're holding it, and then when they relax from there. So the graph up here is really nice to see in the sense of like you've got to look to see how quickly that fatigue happens. It looked like on the left side she was starting to fatigue on that 3rd rep, but then she was able to lift it back up. So we'd be watching for that. If she was dropping heavily from that, we know that she fatigues pretty quickly through the hamstring. It gives us peak force, so we can understand what her percentage of force is compared to body weight, and some normative data. So you can see 2% symmetrical, which is great. And then we have, what's that bottom one? I can't see it.
Rate of force development.
Rate of force development. So it's just quick how quick she can generate that force. Again, 10% difference, and you can see that that's slightly altered compared to the time before, and that's largely because the first session, the first testing day there was when she was fresh and she hadn't done anything that day. The second, she had a rest day and then we tested, and the second time was a track session and then we tested the next day, so she was just slightly fatigued through there. But again, anything under 10% we're pretty happy with. And then we've got the drop jump data on the right hand side. Again, peak force and total force, and then the two things that we're really interested in is the ground contact and the RSI. So an RSI of 3 is classed as like pretty high up there, like relatively elite, particularly for a female. So this is the main metric that we're looking at from a fatigue perspective. If her RSI is dropping, then we know that her nervous system is fatigued and she's not able to have that same output. So that's the main thing that we're looking at from that side of things. Because she's a sprinter, she needs to be quick on the ground, so the ground contacts should always be below 0.2.
From a S&C point of view, how much of that data would change your prescription on the day if she was going to do a lift after testing? How much of that would you just change, like how much eccentric loading that P was getting on the day, or would you just bias maybe like a short lever or something like that?
Could. It sort of depends. Like I think you'll find that if you to test really accurately, you want to have the same conditions and test at the same time, and it's really tricky obviously because her training load's so high and there's going to be a fatigue component. I think you can rely on that data like we do at North. So like in a counter movement jump, let's say someone's average is 50 centimeters and then they're jumping like 40, like that's probably when I'd say, okay, alarm bells, like what can we modify?
Yeah.
But I'd still probably bias modifying training on the track as opposed to actually in the gym from that perspective. But yeah, it kind of depends, yeah.
So like, okay, so
Whereas for me, like I'd
Yeah.
just be thinking like overall load, okay, fatigue's happening.
yeah,
So we just drop a couple
yeah,
of
so
steps.
essentially keeping the same movements, you're just stripping back volume and
Yeah.
intensities
Yeah.
and things like
And
that.
then I might go, all right, rest day tomorrow,
Yeah.
retest for all right, cool,
Yeah.
then we'll go track.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah.
Cool.
So I guess these were her Nordic scores that we had like pre-injury because she was also training at the gym.
Yeah, so the bottom 4 are pre-injury, and then the top one is 5 weeks post-injury.
And her eccentric hamstring strength, like in a Nordic, is pretty poor, to be honest. Like due to probably not being able to do a lot of it because of the tendinopathies in the past. But from an AFLW perspective, we want to have about 300 to 350 is sort of where we want our playing group. Anyone that's under 300, we're like trying to get it up. As being a sprinter, like she was doing it after training, but it probably should be higher. So I think it's going to be something that they're going to have to work on in the off season a lot, is trying to get that eccentric strength up. Probably more 350, 400, I'd say. Yep.
And you could see 5 weeks, she was pretty close to where she was pre-injury. So we knew she had her strength back, and she had about the same asymmetry from left to right. Her right was 6.5 higher than her left, whereas pre-injury she was 6.2. So we were pretty comfortable that meant we could start to push things a little bit more when she had that strength back.
And interestingly, that's the 35-day mark too. So like she was basically back to where she was before the injury at that 35-day mark, which is what the research was indicating. So that was the kind of like the double green light.
So this is how we structured her week in this phase. So we had 2 track sessions, 2 lower body, 2 upper body, a pool, a bike, a couple of movement sessions, but we designed it so she could have 2 full rest days to recover from that. So she still had a really high training load, but we just tweaked things. Her track training load was significantly reduced compared to what it was previously. Her movement sessions were based around improving her tendinopathy. So it's probably important to mention that she'd done isometric holding for 12 months for the tendinopathy without really any change. So the thing that made the biggest change for her was just hip mobility. We got her hip mobility back, and that decreased significantly. Any questions about the weekly structure?
Do you have clients at 1:30 or not?
No.
Cool.
How was this strategy implemented from the get-go and was stuck to, or did you have to tweak
So
a couple of
each
things?
phase.
Yeah,
we
but
would
like in
tweak.
terms of like the structure itself,
No, we're up to
did you feel like that?
Yep.
Felt like that was
Yep. We took the bike session out relatively quickly,
Yeah.
and then we took the pool session out
be substituted with anything or just the
Just
methods?
take
Yep.
So that was kind of what it looked like in the app that we use. So just so everything's in one spot and she can very clearly understand like what's going on. On the Tuesdays and Thursdays, like because she's a PT, she wanted to do her own upper body session, and we just said, cool, whatever. This is more from like the rehab, I guess, perspective, but just started off with, working out what she was actually able to tolerate, keeping in mind that the most important thing at this stage and really throughout the rehab was actually what she was doing on the track. So the rehab and the training from a gym perspective was aimed at helping her stay on the track, and it wasn't supposed to take away from the track. So the last thing you want to do is basically give her something that was so hard that it cooked her, that then her output on the track was poorer, because that's just going to delay the things. We just basically built on her isometrics that she started with the physio, and everyone tolerates things differently, but we worked out that she could tolerate like eccentric hamstring slides double leg to start with, and then she could also do like hamstring curls double leg. So that's pretty much where we started from a hamstring perspective. Then over time we just built it to single leg and 2 up 1 down and the hamstring curl and things like that. But that was more around her tolerance level, more so than anything. Yeah, so I guess the big questions for us in this phase, this is the next phase when we're starting to accumulate the reps. So we've already introduced a lot of the movements and now we're starting to do more and more of it. Is number one thing is like, how do we know that she's tolerating it? I think this is probably the area in a musk rehab that goes wrong a lot of the time. Like when you see like AFL players get re-injured or something, it's probably when they go to the point where they start accumulating a lot of the stimulus. So for us, it's just really important. How do we know that she's tolerating it? How do we manage the gym and the running loads together? So biasing, I guess, the running loads. And then in this stage, like what testing are we doing to make sure that she is tolerating it? So like the counter movement jumps and things like that, like we talked about, to get a nervous system output. Cool. So I guess in this stage, this is what we're going for. So obviously there's the physiological and psychological adaptations that we're aiming for now. So starting to build on her speed, power, strength, things like that.
And this will be different depending on what the task is, right? So this is just generic, like she doesn't need change of direction or anything like that, but let's say it's a footy player and things like that, we need to focus on those aspects as well.
Yep. And then like once we've introduced the exercises, like how we actually like progressing them. Obviously she's not just going to do the same thing for 3 months, like where are we starting to where are we heading towards, and just planning out how that looks from like a progression perspective. Obviously the continued education as well, we always bang on about it, but it's really important, especially when you go into a new phase. Taking all the data and continuing talking shit with the client and keeping that buy-in, I reckon, is super important too.
Cool. So from a case-specific perspective, we had a 5-week focus for this, where we transitioned from 2 track sessions to 3 track sessions, focusing on building volume and intensity, and then just building upon more progressions from a gym perspective. So her weekly structure went to this. So 3 track sessions, 2 lower body, 2 upper body, a pull with still 2 rest days. So you can see the bike went out, we increased to another track session. Any questions?
Yeah, and that was just, I guess, building on, so it's relatively similar to the previous program. I think we started with like pin squats, so reduced range of motion squatting, because it was pretty early on, and we've just progressed it to a barbell back squat. Some of the hamstring stuff, so she was doing double leg sliders, we moved to single leg. We moved to single leg hamstring curls in that phase. And then, we added in, by this stage, her tendinopathy had cleared up. We added in the trap bar deadlift and like hinge type movements to get the proximal hamstring strength too. Added in some isometrics on the GHD, and basically, just kept progressing the exercises keeping in mind that the track volume and the days on the track too are also increasing.
So this is what her running progressions look like throughout that time. So she was doing 4 running type sessions a week. So you can see that we started with a lot of resisted running initially. So if we decrease, obviously adding resisted will decrease the velocity, which will decrease the amount of load that's going through the hamstring. So that's where we started. We started with 10 metre efforts, built into 15, into 20s, 25s, 30s, until we knew she was tolerating that really well, and then we transitioned away from resisted. And then we also we worked on volume by adding slow tempos. So you can see where she first started from a slow tempo perspective, 120 metres by 2 reps with an 8-minute recovery. She had 18 to 20 seconds to do those, whereas later in that week we did 120 by 4, and then they were a little bit faster, 17 to 19. And then we just slowly progressed up the metres per second, kind of each session to make sure she was tolerating it. And the volume of sessions continued to progress as well. It was around that 7-week mark where she was hitting a pretty close to top speed. So she was starting to hit 90% efforts for a 60 metre there. And from a pool perspective, you can see that we started with 45s, went to 50s, 55. From a 400 metre perspective, she's roughly a 53, 54 second runner. We wanted to build we wanted her to keep the capacity to work for that length of time from a lactic perspective. And what we did was just decrease the reps to manage fatigue the closer we got to more normal training on the track. And then that week 9 is a pretty standard loading session that I would probably have her at even when she wasn't injured. So one day excel to max speed, hitting it at top speed as much as she can, into a speed endurance session later in the week. So that's something like a repeat 100 metres with a relatively full recovery, and then a lactic session as well, which is kind of 300 metre efforts with a shorter break, and then into it again. But that's at a lower intensity than the other 2 sessions of the week.
Just a quick question.
Yeah.
Did you have this Ash pre-designed for the 4 weeks, or were you adjusting per week, seeing how she was tolerating it, or did you already have it sort of? Yep.
So when we first sat down, I designed the whole time.
Yep.
And then I would just tweak as we were progressing through. So I was just like, all right, she hit this time in this session, she tolerated that, okay. I think we can probably progress things up a little bit quicker here.
Yep.
So it tweaked a little bit through, but I had a base of what I wanted to achieve throughout that from the start.
Yep. And did you also include some technical components on your sessions, like maybe acceleration postures or form runs or whatever it is?
Yeah. So we'd film most efforts, and we'd sit down and discuss certain components of those.
Curiously, how did she enjoy the pool sessions?
She
Did
said
that session?
the hardest thing that she's ever done, but she just loves exercising.
Yeah.
So it's pretty easy to get her up and about doing something. She just wants to be exercising. So she liked it.
Cool.
Like hard from a output perspective, but actually pretty easy on the body from a recovery perspective, which is good.
So this is sort of, I guess some of the gym progressions that we touched on earlier. And like I was saying, I think she probably could have introduced like some of the things like the double leg sliders and the hamstring curl earlier on. Like typically at footy, I would probably do them towards maybe like day 8 or 9. Even with the sliders, like probably trying day 4 or 5 in this instance. But so that's why I guess the gym side of things was a bit back-ended, because she'd just been doing like static stuff. But yeah, we just progressed according to how she was tolerating. So it's just having conversations with her, like how is your body feeling? How do you think you're adapting, and that type of thing, and just progressing as needed. And then mentioning before as well, but both knee and hip dominant exercises into the program, as well as keeping isometric, concentric, and eccentrics moving forward, just because of the nature of sprinting. So I guess this is like a non-exhaustive list of some of the exercises that I think you could probably pick from. When you're picking knee or hip dominant, we picked from within these, but obviously there's shitloads more exercises that you could add to this list. I think there's just ones that have used a fair bit. So the way I like to think about exercise is just as a continuum. Like you probably would have seen lots of those Instagram posts or things before about how to progress things, and I just try and work out like where they're currently at, what they're able to tolerate, and then where is the end for this exercise, or like what are we actually working towards. So just a matter of, I guess, picking the exercises that are relevant from what she's able to tolerate, keeping in mind the tendinopathies and things like that, and increasing track work. So I think that was your question before as well, with like how do we actually know that she's tolerating it. But yeah, so I think what we would do typically at footy is on a Monday night, we jump test the girls on a counter movement jump just to see their output across a year, across the season. The subjective rating, so part of the app, it'll ask you a bunch of questions before she'll go to the track, before she goes to the gym, like energy levels, sleep, things like that, just to get a bit of a gauge. But I probably rely most on, like, I guess, coaching intuition. So, you know, when someone walks in the door, like I'm always trying to pick up, like, are they slumped over like this today? Or like, do they look like they're bouncing around and full of energy? Like, I think things like that will give you a better understanding of how they're actually feeling. Because obviously with athletes, they often will report that they're feeling good because they want to do the session, as opposed to like, I'm cooked today, and knowing that you're going to modify it. So, yeah, obviously as well, looking at like an actual output. So is she able to progress like top speed at the track, and is she continuing to progress? Because if she's not, like, and she's able to tolerate, you know, she's hit 10.5 meters per second before and she can't get it past 9, like what's going on? And then, yeah, just like the intent. So maybe with like the plyometrics or the jumping in the gym, for example, like looking at the intent, the effort behind it on the track, the way she warms up, these type of things, or is she just like kind of going through the motions? As well as, yeah, wearable data. So I'm big on the Whoop, but it tracks your recovery, your heart rate variability. So we know, like, you know, if her heart rate variability is 80 usually, and then one night she comes in and it's sitting at 40, she's probably not recovering, or she probably hasn't recovered enough, or showing that her body needs a bit more time, and we might push the session back or modify. So I found that to be a really accurate way to gauge someone's fatigue levels as well.
So from a relevant testing perspective, it's all the same as the ones that we went through before, the force plate data, and then still the Nord board as well. But from a speed perspective, we use free laps to get our timing. So on acceleration and max speed days, we have enough cones from a free lap to get every 10 metre interval for 100 metres. So
It's like a timing gate type thing.
So we can see where she's hitting, or how long it takes her to get through each 10 metres, but it also gives us a top speed output, so what her kilometre per hour or a metre per second output is. So we can see how close she is progressing to what she needs to. And then also how well does she build that speed throughout a run. Ideally, you should be seeing kind of like a nice little increase in speed each 10 metre interval if we're doing 60 metre. If we're doing 100 metre, we should see a nice build, probably up to 60, and then just a slow decrease from 60 to 100 from there. So we would use those probably 2 days a week for her 3 sessions, just to gauge that aspect.
Cool. So I guess, yeah, the next phase, starting to integrate the actual task, which is more from, in this case, like actually high speed running. So the couple of things that we kind of think about is like, how do we actually integrate the task? Like, so logistically, it was a lot easier in this case that Ash is her track coach and managing the rehab because it's all under his care. But it gets tricky if we're doing the rehab and then someone else is the track coach, and like that's when you have to think about the logistics of things, and as Ash has run into a few times. And then just
Interesting experiences.
the same thing with just monitoring progression. Yeah, so I guess these are the things that we think about during this specific phase. Maybe you want to go through it?
Yeah, so like, is it just, has she met the tasks breakdown that we've gone through? Is she still continuing to progress in her objective measures? Continue to education to make sure she returns safely. So for her, we started this phase at week 7, post-injury. And so basically this was just approaching normal training or loading as if she wasn't injured. It was 3 weeks in length until she was returning to competition and had a big crossover with the late accumulation phase. And we restructured her weekly schedule again to try and decrease fatigue levels and maximise performance leading into competition. So her weekly structure went to 3 track, 1 gym, 1 upper body, 1 hamstring rehab, 2 movements with 3 full rest days. So the tracks still stayed on the same day. She did a lower body early in the week. She did just some hamstring rehab on the Wednesday. And then, so she had 1 less lower body, she had 1 less upper body, and she had no pull session, and she had an extra day of recovery.
Cool. And I guess this is pretty much where we've been at the last few weeks, but with the competition as well.
Yeah, so we're just really looking for limitation-free task or goals achieved, continuing to maintain a training stimulus to try and minimise risk of injury. We want to reset our goals to make sure that she's achieving everything that she wants to achieve. And again, just ongoing patient education. So for her, she returned to competition 10 weeks post-injury. So she went and ran a 400 metre at Queensland State Champs. In her heat, she ran a 57.58. So I think we highlighted before she was a 53.8 runner. So not a great output in her first race. And I got an interesting phone call the next day. So she still made the final, and she came second in her heat. But I had a conversation with her the next day, and she was like, "I'm not good enough for this. I'm not going to run the final. I noticed my hamstring in the warm-up. I don't think this is right." And I was just like, "Okay, explain that to me a little bit more." And she just went into it quite negative, and she was, and I was just like, "Okay, so what was the difference between you warming up in that environment versus you warming up in any training session that we'd done?" And obviously the biggest difference was she hadn't really had any competition in 3.5 years. She was up there by herself, warming up. She didn't have me there to reinforce kind of the positivity around it. So she went in very, very negative, thinking that her body wasn't going to cope with that. She didn't have a great output in her first race, but then she changed her thought process going into that second day. And you can see she was able to run 2 seconds faster and be able to get that national qualifier in the final, just by changing her mindset and having a little bit more belief that she could do that. I was really confident that she hadn't done any issue to her hamstring from what she described. She just ran a 400 metre after it without any issue, and she was no longer feeling the hamstring post-race. So I was really comfortable that her hamstring in itself was in a fine place. But she definitely, I thought we had spoken about the psychological aspects a lot leading into this, but it was still a lot more important than I probably expected it to be, kind of going into that with her not competing for such a long period of time. But then she was able to back up competition the following week. She did a 200 metre at a high velocity meet and then ran a national qualifier for her 200 as well. So each race she kind of did from there, she started to just build a lot more confidence around that she does belong and she should be there and she can have a high output. And she just started to build that confidence in herself again. this is kind of what the journey looked like.
Yep. So I guess from injury all the way to competing, how long ago was the competition now? 2 weeks?
No,
Or
4 weeks.
4 weeks, okay. And that's kind of a breakdown, I guess, of like what happened at some of the phases, like I guess an overview. And then just adding in, I guess, keeping in mind the re-injury risk. So yeah, this is something that sort of put together just to summarize, I guess, the rehab.
And then from there, this is what her running looked like in this phase. So we didn't do any 400 metre efforts, like we had only done 300 metre efforts from a lactic perspective. So we thought, all right, at the start of the week, let's do just one 400 metre effort so you get the feel of what a 400 felt like. And she was able to run a 56.3, which was obviously faster than she ran in her heat. So I knew she had the output there, which was better than what she ran in her heat. We did a very small max speed session leading into her state champs that she did. And then the next week, we did a really minimal week. So we did an Excel session. She just did 430s just to kind of get ticking over. Then she did a lactic session where we just increased the intensity of it a little bit. And then she did her high velocity meet later, so on the Saturday. Then the next week after that is kind of where I would say the highest amount of kind of volume or intensity that we would do. So you can see all of those are around 90 or to 95% intensity for every aspect that she's running. So that's probably the most intense week we would look to do, but I felt like we needed that stimulus for her. And then again, we just eased things off a little bit for that week. We then went to a really normal week at week 14, where she did some excels, she did some max speed, and then she ran another 400 meet. So that was the weekend just gone, and she ran a 54.8. So again, almost a second faster than she ran at her national qualifier up in Queensland. So we are hopeful that she should run a 53 something this coming week at nationals. She's definitely training to be able to do that, so we'll see how she goes. What's really important is that we manage her nervous system ongoing, so we need to make sure we have regular deload weeks, where some weeks are a lot higher in volume or higher intensity, other weeks are not that. And then post-nationals, we'll just reevaluate our goals. At the moment, it looks like she might head over to Japan to do some competitions. But from a strength perspective, I want to have a really big off-season to build that eccentric strength, because she hasn't been able to do that for such a long period of time. I think having that eccentric strength will really minimise her injury risk going forward. So I think we can do that where we decrease running volume really significantly and fatigue her quite heavily from the eccentric side of things to build that capacity up.
From a psychological standpoint, have you done anything, given that she felt like her hamstring was going to go, or she felt some kind of tension and feeling around that?
Yeah.
Have you implemented, based off that experience, have you implemented anything going forward for this coming?
I'm going to be there, so.
You reckon that'll be?
So I think that'll be a big factor. Yeah. So we haven't implemented anything in particular, but we've spoken about it frequently about that. So she has that awareness that that's what I thought that was. She hasn't had that awareness again since. I think it was just a mental component to being back at competition, being really nervous about competing again, not understanding whether she was good enough to be competing. I think that was the big factor.
It's really fascinating. Like at footy, I see it a lot when I do someone's rehab, because you're with them like 4 or 5 times a week. You go through the whole thing, the ups and downs, and you return them on that, like on their game day. And I've had them a couple of times say like, oh, thank God you were there. Like I was so nervous until I saw you, and things like that. Like it makes such a big difference, I think, especially when you're returning like an athlete to something that they basically lived their whole life for. Like it's such a big thing for them doing what they train for. feel like just having that person that's helped you through it there, like they just feel so much safer, which is it's really interesting.
From a task and creation point of view, like doing the task is one thing, and then doing it in the environment that is created by, like whether it's game day, whether it's a meet or whatever, like it's pretty hard to kind of recreate.
Yeah, you can't.
Or, well, yeah, you can't. Like you can get as close.
Where like
as
we
good
try
as
and
you can,
push
but-
competition in a training
Yeah.
session, but it's nothing like
What
going
you-
and
what you don't
competing
experience,
against
yeah.
people that you've been competing against for years
Yeah,
and
yeah,
years.
Especially when you race people the last 12 metres. I tried to jump in and run 100 with her, and I got 12 metres. I think I got shot in the back of the leg. Yeah.
Yeah, so I guess from all of that, we just wanted to highlight that we have a particular model that we follow, and although we've gone into a whole heap of detail around that, you guys don't necessarily have to go into that much detail, but we find it really easy to have a model of just, all right, this is a person, this is what they've come in with, what do I need to think about from a big picture perspective to get them back to what the things that they want, and then you can break down those little components and then just go, right, yeah, we're achieving those things. I think it just helps us keep on us to be kept in line around what we're trying to achieve, but also helps the patient understand what does the journey look like and how what we're doing is helping us achieve those things.
Okay.
Cool.
In terms of like financial side of things, was this being funded privately from her for the coaching?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. And would things have changed if she was in a position not to see you guys as regularly? Do you think maybe the outcome may have been different?
Yeah, potentially. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yep. I think having frequent touch points with her certainly made the process a lot easier.
Yep.
Yeah.
I've done ACL rehab at footy where I see the player like 4 or 5 times a week versus in private practice where you might see them once a week. And like I know that one's an athlete and one's probably more gen pop, but it takes so much longer. Same with Achilles, same with anything I think. Like the touch point is definitely the key. Like, because so much can change as well. Like in a week, like there's been so much to change. Like I can have someone on a Monday and be progressing them by a Tuesday. And if you've got to wait a whole nother week, like they're just falling behind. So it makes it definitely challenging. Yeah. Very cool. Is there any questions? Anyone else have any other questions about any of that?
Reflecting on this last 16 weeks, what may you do differently next time if you have another athlete similar situation? Like, what are the room for improvements from a coaching point of view? You think?
Good question.
Do you think maybe like heading up to Queensland for that event, you then there may have been something you would do different, like being with the athlete more?
Yeah.
Or?
Yeah, I think being there would certainly help. I think what else? I think probably using objective measures just a little bit more than we did. Like I was a little bit hesitant to use them at certain times just from a load perspective. So I think I'd probably be a bit more rigid with that. What else would I do differently though?
I find
I think it's been a very successful,
I like to reflect with them, like, and this is a bit different because she hasn't really run the actual race that she's been training for yet, but when a footy player, like, because we have to do kind of like a mini audit, I guess, after every rehab, and so we'll sit down and say, like, how did you feel throughout the process? Like, did you think it went well? Like, how are you feeling now? What did you learn? And like things like that, and I do it with a lot of my clients as well, that generally probably do it more with people that are training for a sport or a surgery, but we'll like ask them afterwards, like questions like that, because I think sometimes people pick up things that you might not have even been pushing that narrative that much, but that was like the one thing they really picked up on, which is interesting. Like I've done it with some clients before that have had like persistent pain and haven't been able to run for ages, and we got them back to running, and I thought that like I did a really good job educating them on certain things that I thought was leading to flare-ups in this persistent pain. And then I'd ask them like, okay, cool, so now you're back to doing what you want. Give me a bit of a reflection on the rehab itself and like what you've learned. And it'd be something a bit random. I'm like, the fuck, like where did that come from? Like that's not what I was going for. And then you're like, okay, well,
What one client takes versus the
yeah.
client, it can be so different. Yeah.
But I find that I love doing that because I think it's made me refine what I say to people a lot. Yeah, like I'll just be really careful now with some of the things that I will say.
Yeah, I think we're both very mindful of
Yep.
how we say certain things. Yeah. We're very mindful not to put any doubt or negative association with almost anything. Yeah.
I think, yeah, and the whole time I will be doing someone's rehab or training someone, whether it's like at footy, whether it's here, whether they've, persistent pain they've had for years or it's a really acute thing, like I think I always try and make the undertone of the rehab like really positive. So that's why we had on it before, like what can they still do? Because you want them feeling good throughout the whole process. And like I think you would have seen it with Fia, like when she got through that race where she ran really well, I reckon since her attitude, like she seems so up and about, like she's
On the weekend.
yeah,
she was so happy. Like
Yep.
that's her second fastest time she's ever ran. Yeah, she was over the moon for days afterwards. So it's exciting going into nationals post that. Yep.
Worst case scenario, she runs the race, gets injured. How do you
Don't put that out there, Chella.
That's a horrible thing.
Yeah.
Horrible thing to say. That's bad.
She won't, but how would you approach that situation?
How would I approach it? I'd probably give her a big hug. I don't know. I'd be very sad.
It's like you're riding the journey with her. The
Yeah,
whole way,
absolutely. Yeah,
Like,
yeah. Like we
she's almost
speak probably every single day,
Yeah, I
like
was gonna
most
say.
days of the week. Yeah.
You're almost friends.
Yeah.
Like, yeah. So
Yeah. I would. I'd have to reflect on what have we done, like where do we feel like that has gone wrong. Yeah, but that would be a terrible outcome.
It's not going to happen.
do you sort of set the expectation that you may not actually prevent an injury from occurring? It's like there's always a
very
chance.
aware of that.
Of
Yeah.
course.
But I think I do think that most injuries are a load factor, and if you can manage those loads relatively well, you can stay relatively injury free. You can have like these little niggles and things like that, but like a real injury, I think you can
So
not prevent, but you can significantly decrease your risk of developing. Yeah.
Yeah, I feel like majority of, especially running related injuries, that there is no mechanism. So like saying footy, like someone lands on your leg and do ACL, that's like a bit different. But if you're getting injured with things like say a hamstring or a bone stress or something like that, like it's probably just training load error, really.
Controlled environment sprinting, like meaning like external.
Yeah.
Like getting
Yeah.
players,
Yeah.
the chaos.
Yeah.
Yeah.
As much. So
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah, and so probably the difference between say like a rehab for hamstring and footy versus with a sprinter is just the 80 to 100%.
so different.
Is so different. So you can actually probably get a footy player back maybe just that little bit quicker because they never actually hit 100% in game. So that top speed is less important. Whereas like she needs to be able to hit a top speed, kind of hold that top speed for as long as she possibly can, or have a greater output in a whole race compared to what a footy player will have at any stage in the game. So that's probably the challenge from that side of things.
and the track group that you guys run, how does that look? Just curiously, is that just everyone's got their individual programs?
Yeah, so
and-
everyone will have. It's very small. Like we keep it very small. There's only 5 people. So I individually program from everyone. I sit down and do like a 2-month block at a time, and then every week I'll just kind of change it based on what's going on. And I'll base that upon like what competitions they've got coming up and things like that. So we're able to keep it very individualised from that side of things.
and cost effective in
Yeah.
the sense of they're not doing a one-on-one, but
Yeah.
you're still keeping your eyes on them.
Exactly. Yeah.
you have to hire the track out completely?
No, we don't.
Just
No, so
use
we just
your
gotta-
lanes and
Yeah, we just got to like the at Moorabbin there. It's just like a general public
Yep.
access to the track. So we can just rock up whenever we like.
fantastic.
I think this is where like having a framework is really good because you can like roadmap it for the client, saying, right, this is what we expect, or this is what we're going to work on in this part, but you're able to tweak it based on what you feel like you need. So it's not super rigid it's not super rigid, but you're following a structure that allows for that reintegration task to be as clean as possible. And I think it's something that when I first came in, I spoke about kind of like the way that I operate, and by no means is it concrete and everyone has to kind of do it like this, but it provides a framework for this is what I'm going to do with this person early on, so I can achieve this in this phase, so that allows them to do that in the next thing, which I think is really cool.
Very cool.
Right, thanks boys.
Yeah,
Cheers.
thank you.
Good. Any other questions? No.
No.
We'll send you the slides as well.
Yeah, awesome. Well done.
Yeah.
Cheers.
Yeah.
Thanks guys.